Valuing and applying rationality, or VAR, is an integral facet of skillful decision making. One part of rationality is about making sense of and having an accurate understanding of the world. Through practicing dispositions such as active open mindedness, intellectual humility, and truth seeking, we can get better at uncovering and getting closer to what is true about the world and what to do about it. A second part of rationality is about having stable and well ordered values or goals, meaning you know what you care about and which values and goals you care about more in any given decision. And the third part of rationality is about behaving in ways that are consistent with your goals and values. By practicing self regulation, developing strategies for impulse control, and learning how to manage habits, we can better align our actions with the things we really care about. Research has shown that the things that contribute to rationality can be taught. Things like developing and practicing metacognition, thinking probabilistically, understanding how habits are formed and can be changed, and knowing when and how to structure decision-making process can help us to become more rational in the way we make decisions and form judgments. In this module, we will provide an introduction to the central components of valuing and applying rationality. First, we will talk about the importance of values and goals, including being explicit when it comes to understanding them and interrogating when and why they might need to be updated. Then we will explore 3 dispositions for skillful decision making that allow us to get closer to knowing what is true about the world. We will briefly touch on examples of how our thinking can be unwittingly influenced by our mood and surroundings, as well as the importance of practicing metacognition. And finally, we will briefly touch upon one area of rational behavior, which is managing habits as a way to ensure that our daily routine actions better align with our goals. In this video, we will focus on values and goals. Every time we make a decision, whether it's individually or with a group, there are underlying things that we care about, either consciously or subconsciously, that we're trying to satisfy. These are our values and our goals. We can have overarching values that follow us across multiple decisions, and we can have smaller values and goals that may relate only to the decision at hand. When decision makers act rationally, they make choices that are consistent with the things they care about, whether big or small. Caring about things and acting in ways that are consistent with your values sounds easy enough, but actually there are many reasons why it can be complicated to act in accordance with our goals. Sometimes we do things that go against what we care about because of unproductive habits. For example, a teenager spending a lot of time in the off season on screens rather than going on runs, even though they really want to make the track team this year. Other times, our choices might reveal preferences that are subconscious or that we are otherwise not aware of. Maybe this teenager doesn't realize it, but perhaps they aren't training in the off season because they're burnt out from sports and other life stressors and they just need time to decompress. Their behavior might show them that they currently value rest and recovery. The charge in this case is to investigate if those temporary preferences align with our long-term goals and values. Sometimes our goals change because the context or our identity or our understanding of the world evolves. So maybe getting on the track team is no longer as important because the student's family situation has changed and it has become a priority to care for a younger sibling after school. Or maybe they used to love track, but they have a newfound interest in theater and have been enjoying working with the stage crew after school. Staying curious about and in tune with the values and goals that drive our decisions requires a sense of agency and practice with self-regulation and self-awareness. And while the ultimate goal is to have stable and well-ordered values, and to act in accordance with them, this isn't something that comes naturally to people. Part of the work of decision education, and the valuing and applying rationality domain in particular, is to help students develop the metacognitive skills to recognize or investigate what they care about, and to update both what they value and the weight and order they give their preferences. In classrooms, this might look like getting students to reflect on who they want to be, what success means to them, and the kind of life they want. It might mean connecting with students on what they care about and then supporting them in seeing when their actions aren't aligned. It can be about helping them to predict the consequences of their actions as a reflective rather than punitive exercise. Mapped onto learning content, it could look like analyzing characters in stories, making inferences about their life philosophies, and then identifying the actions they take that are in support of or counter to them. To get students ready for these kind of metacognitive conversations, we encourage classroom or at-home practices that build in opportunities for self-awareness and self-regulation. For example, regular opportunities for students to engage in authentic journaling about their thinking and learning, or built-in opportunities in the classroom for students to ask themselves, how confident am I in my understanding of this material? How is this learning or activity going for me? Does it feel hard, easy, enjoyable, frustrating? Why? Getting curious about and investigating what you care about for both big and small decisions is an important step in making rational decisions that align with your values and goals. At the beginning of this module, we touched briefly upon how self-regulation and metacognition can contribute to a decision maker's rationality. In this video, we are going to delve a little more deeply into some of the research that shows us how metacognition specifically can play a role in students' learning and behaviors in school and beyond. So broadly speaking, metacognition is often thought of as thinking about thinking, but it's more complete to describe it as including knowledge, awareness, and control of one's own thought processes. This comic here does a nice job of illustrating what this could look like. So this student here is thinking about the process of writing down their assignments. They are aware of how this process helps them to remember to complete their assignments and how this in turn impacts their grades. And also they are thinking about what else they could have control over that would result in a similar outcome. So this student is demonstrating a knowledge, awareness of, and control over their thought processes. There has been a whole host of research about fostering metacognition, specifically in K through 12 classrooms. And as a result of this research, we understand that metacognition is a really complex construct that's understood differently by different researchers. This diagram here is just one researcher's theoretical framework of it, and as we can see, there are lots of components of metacognition: knowledge, regulation, monitoring, evaluation. It's really not important for decision educators to understand all the theoretical frameworks around metacognition. We recognize that it's a complex concept, but in this lesson, we'll be just touching upon an overview, and we'll be focusing on three things specifically. We'll be thinking about what are some things metacognition predicts about a person. We'll be thinking about whether or not it can be trained, which is particularly relevant for those of you working directly with students. And finally, we'll be looking at how do other individual differences or traits or other characteristics of people relate to metacognition. And of course, metacognition is in itself an individual difference, but we will be exploring how it relates to others as well. Let's start by looking at what metacognition is related to that we might care about. Here's an example of how we can measure metacognition. In this example here, we can see a questionnaire that asks students to respond to statements about their learning. So for example, I know when I understand something. Students respond to each statement with never, sometimes, or always, and based on their answers, they get a score. Researchers had 7th graders answer questions like these and then compared their scores to their GPAs. And they found that students who had higher metacognition scores, meaning they answered always more often. So for example, I always know when I understand something, or I always learn more when I'm interested in the topic. They found that they also had higher science GPAs. So what this means is that researchers have found that metacognition can predict certain outcomes like GPA. This is not the only outcome they predict. There are other outcomes it predicts too. But the question really is this useful to know if metacognition is not a movable construct or not something that can be changed about a person? So something you might be wondering is, can a person's metacognition move or change? Current scholars in the field are wondering about the same question. Can learning be enhanced by training our metacognitive abilities? The overall consensus is that training metacognition is helpful. It does lead to benefits in the form of significantly large and positive effects on student learning achievement. And we'll talk about one training intervention to give you a sense of what that might look like and what the benefits are. So in this study, researchers worked with 8th graders. And some were assigned to a journaling group in which they journaled about their mood, their energy, their learning, and some were assigned to a control group where they did not journal. Now in this study, students in both the journal and the control groups took a math pretest, and you can see how they scored here. And then, over a period of time, the journal group completed forms like this after their lessons. And you should note that this journal here has nothing to do with math content. It's just thinking about their thinking. So questions like, how's their learning going today? It provided no extra math training. But interestingly, we can see here in the post-test that the group that spent time journaling about their learning process did far better on the math post-test than the students in the control group who did not journal. So journaling about metacognition, or getting students to just think about their thinking, actually improved their math scores. Here we have an abstract from a scholarly study. You do not need to read the whole thing, but I want to draw your attention to two things. Scholars have noted that metacognition is related to intellectual ability, but it's independent. So it doesn't mean that having intellectual ability is the same as being able to track and reflect on that intellectual ability. And what some research is showing is that metacognition is actually a better predictor of learning performance than intelligence. So being able to reflect and think about your thinking can be a better predictor of learning performance than raw intellectual abilities. Now, as we saw in the math test study, metacognition is something we can train students in. To give an example of how meaningful this type of training could be and the power of metacognition, we can turn to a 2018 study that shows that students who had the lowest skills in reading actually benefited the most from metacognition training. And in another study, researchers found that even in children as young as preschool age, those who struggled the most with self-regulation actually benefited the most from a mindfulness intervention, which is related to metacognition. Now, you're probably very familiar with the terms self-regulation or self-regulated learning. We just want to note that these concepts are all interrelated. Metacognition is just one piece of a larger framework around self-regulated learning. And from all of this, we really want to show that thinking about thinking and thinking about emotions is good for students, it benefits learning, and it can impact decision making. In the last video, we talked about the importance of understanding our goals and values so that we can make decisions that align with them. Another key component of valuing and applying rationality is about making sense of and having an accurate understanding of the world. Getting better at knowing what is true helps us get better at knowing what to do. There are many traps our minds can fall into when forming judgments about the world and the information we consume. Some are due to cognitive biases caused by the hardwiring of our brains, and some may be due to social or contextual factors. Sometimes we are operating on bad or limited information. Or sometimes a situation is so complex that it's hard to tease out all of the nuances of what is really happening. But the good news is that we can develop and practice dispositions that help us to get better at improving the accuracy of our understanding. Dispositions are habits of mind, attitudes, or cognitive tendencies that, with practice, can become habitual so that we employ them naturally and automatically. In this video, we will address 3 dispositions that are central to good decision-making: active open-mindedness, intellectual humility, and truth-seeking. Let's start with active open-mindedness. The disposition of active open-mindedness is characterized by several qualities. When we are actively open-minded, we engage in a deep and unbiased search for options, evidence, and reasons. This means we actively seek evidence for beliefs we might not hold or favor. It doesn't mean that we are trying to necessarily convince ourselves to hold those beliefs, but rather the goal is to seek a fuller understanding of other ways of thinking, ideas, or beliefs, which in turn can help deepen, refine, or recalibrate the beliefs we already hold. Second, active open-mindedness is about a willingness to question your initial intuition and postpone closure. Often, what our intuition tells us may be impacted by all kinds of cognitive biases, implicit biases, and other mental traps that we may not be aware are influencing our thinking. Skillful decision makers understand that their initial intuition may be flawed. And actually, in the next video, we will explore more in depth some examples of how our initial thinking may be influenced in surprising ways that we're unaware of. Third, active open-mindedness is about cognitive empathy, or being able to see things through another's perspective. When we attempt to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, we can deepen our understanding of why they believe what they believe and identify places where our values and goals intersect or diverge. And finally, active open-mindedness is about being able to hold multiple truths at once and to see the legitimacy of multiple perspectives. This is not saying that all perspectives are meant to be considered as equal or equally legitimate, but to be able to see nuance in people's perspectives and not operate in a binary fashion of all right or all wrong is a useful disposition for skillful decision making. Let's turn our attention now to intellectual humility, which is about being able to recognize that our beliefs might be wrong. Intellectually humble decision makers have a well-calibrated sense of the accuracy of their beliefs. In other words, they have a sense of how confident or unsure they should be in their beliefs. For example, imagine you are working on a team with colleagues to choose a new curriculum for your school. You have an idea of what would be the best program for your students, but some of your colleagues disagree and suggest a different curriculum. Someone with a well-calibrated sense of accuracy would be open to considering their colleagues' perspectives and reasonings. They might ask clarifying questions to better understand their colleagues' ideas and explore the strengths and weaknesses of all the options. They might even suggest piloting more than one program to see which one works best in practice. Intellectually humble decision makers willingly entertain the possibility that they might be wrong, and they're open to learning from the experiences of others. Intellectual humility is about asking, what am I missing here? Being intellectually humble doesn't mean that your thinking is necessarily wrong, but in the cases when it is wrong, it's about being able to admit it. The last disposition we're going to talk about is truth-seeking, or striving for the best knowledge possible in any given situation. A truth seeker does not seek to defend what they already believe, but rather takes what scientist and author Julia Galef calls the scout mindset. A truth seeker asks probing questions and follows reasons and evidence wherever they lead, even if the results go against their previously held beliefs. It's about trying to know the world as it actually is rather than as we wish it to be. The biggest threat to truth-seeking is overconfidence, or the sense that you already know every facet of how the world works, what's going to happen, or what you should do. There are lots of questions truth seekers ask, and here are just a few. They might ask, what are my initial assumptions? Is there something I'm hoping to find? Is there something I'm avoiding looking for? What information would it take to change my mind? What sources am I looking at? Am I missing any? Am I under or overemphasizing any sources? In addition to asking questions such as those, truth seekers utilize elements of the scientific method beyond science classrooms. So engaging in observation, experimentation, and the testing of hypotheses is a strong defense against our brain's natural tendency to believe only what it wants to believe. To support students in practicing and honing these dispositions, we encourage classroom or at-home practices that encourage young people to ask questions like the ones mentioned in this video. Provide space and time for students to evaluate their assumptions or those of others. Help students to seek out information that challenges their viewpoints or provides them with an outside view they hadn't considered. Support students with the media literacy skills to verify sources of information. Providing students with the opportunity to regularly practice active open-mindedness, intellectual humility, and truth-seeking in classrooms can help to make these dispositions more habitual and easier to employ outside of the classroom. In defining rationality in this module, we have talked about three main areas: making sense of and having an accurate understanding of the world, having stable and well-ordered values or goals, and behaving in ways that are consistent with what you care about. In this video, we're going to take a step back to explore some of the ways in which, unbeknownst to us, our rational judgment formation and decision-making can sometimes be influenced by various factors such as our mood and our surroundings. In understanding that our decision-making is not as free from interference as we may think, the importance of developing skills for valuing and applying rationality becomes even more striking. So to begin this exploration, we are going to talk about a classic study that illustrates the powerful effect of your own mood on decision-making. In this study, some participants were given an exercise that helped them focus on a happy memory, which they then wrote down. And some participants were given an exercise that had them imagine a sad memory, which they then wrote down. After this, participants were asked to estimate the probability that certain future events would happen to them. So some of the events were positive events, like being able to take a vacation in Europe within the next 3 years, and some of the events were negative events, like being mugged within the next 3 years. These are just some examples. There were a number of events, both positive and negative, that participants were presented with. And for each event, they had to estimate the probability that it would happen to them on a scale of 1 to 100. These were subjective probabilities, or probabilities derived from the participant's own judgment. So let's look at what happened. For the people who had been asked to imagine a happy memory, they rated the probability of the positive events happening as pretty high, and they rated the probability of the negative events happening as relatively low. The pattern was different, however, for those who had been asked to remember a sad memory. They rated the probability of the negative or sad events happening as really high, and they rated the positive events much lower. So this is a really powerful illustration of how even thinking about something unrelated to what you're making a decision about can influence the mood you're in and the judgments you make. Now, that study focused primarily on positive and negative moods, but researchers have identified specific other moods you might want to think about or evaluate before making important decisions. One mnemonic device for this is HALT, which stands for hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And what research has shown is that it's really helpful to halt and not make decisions when you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, because these states of being can impact your judgment. Now, this article here in Forbes was focused specifically on entrepreneurs needing to halt, but many researchers have shown that this is something that's beneficial for all of us. Recently, a group of researchers expanded the HALT model. They added an extra L for late to try to see if they could reduce mistakes in a hospital setting. So they adopted this model to try to reduce medication errors in a medical ward where incidences of assigning the wrong medication was quite high. So as part of the intervention, they taught the medical staff about the HALT model first, and then they put posters all around the ward with the acronym and these guiding questions. And they had supervisors stop in and check with staff to ask them, do you need to halt? What they observed was that after implementing these interventions, the medical staff reduced their medication mistakes by over 30%. So this is just another example of how your mental or physical state in the moment of making a decision can have an impact. So as we can see, things like mood, emotional and physical needs, and personal preferences can influence the way we make decisions. As we become more skilled decision makers, it's important to understand this and develop strategies for managing ourselves and our needs before making a high impact decision or complex decision. Now, you can do your best to be aware of your mood and your thinking, and you can do your best to avoid making big decisions when you're in certain mood states. But also, it's important to give yourself grace and understand that you are functioning in the bigger ecosystem of the world. And sometimes, even when you're in full control of your mood or emotions, the context of the world you live in can impact your decision making. So let's look at an example of how seemingly irrelevant situations can impact the way we think. In one study, participants were in hotel rooms where they couldn't see the outside world. There was a hotel worker who would be called to deliver room service, and each time he went to a room, he always reported that the temperature was in the mid-50s, no matter what the temperature really was. And then he gave the truth about the weather, so whether it was sunny, partly sunny, cloudy, or rainy. Researchers then tracked the tips that the hotel worker received from the study participants. And what they found was that the tips the worker received changed drastically depending on the weather. So whether it was sunny or cloudy or rainy influenced how much people were willing to spend on the tip for the room service delivery, as you can see here on this graph. People tipped significantly more when they thought it was sunny versus when they thought it was rainy. So if we distill down what happened here, people tipped differently for the same service in the same type of hotel room just based on what they were told the weather was. We think we tip based on service or how much money we have or how the food is, but in reality, we are impacted sometimes by contextual factors that may seem surprising to our rational minds. And this is just a great example of how and why it's so important to get curious about the way we are making decisions. At the beginning of this module, we referred to the importance of behaving in ways that are consistent with your goals and values. Managing our habits, or the routines or behaviors that we often do automatically without deliberate thought, is one way to ensure that more of the choices we make each day align with the values and goals we care about. Researchers estimate that 40% of our daily actions are actually habits directed by our unconscious minds. Therefore, any habit we do over a long period of time really affects the way we live, for better or for worse. By recognizing our actions as habits and thinking about how they are formed, we can begin to shape our habits instead of allowing them to shape us. All of us have some habits that improve our lives and which we should nurture, and some habits which have negative effects and which we may want to crush. So we may have habits that are related to the foods we eat, the activities we choose to help us manage our stress, the ways we tackle work and other important tasks, the ways we intersect with friends, family, classmates, or colleagues, or even the ways we react to new information in the news or on social media. Sticking to habits that improve our lives is a challenge for all of us. Think of all the New Year's resolutions that get abandoned almost immediately. But by understanding the psychology of how habits work, and specifically how a process called the habit loop trains our brains to do the same thing over and over again, we can get better at nurturing or crushing habits to make our lives better. Here we have a visual representation of a habit loop. A habit loop starts with a cue, which can be anything that reminds us of doing the habit. So it could be a certain feeling, which could be emotional or physical. It could be a time of day, a place, the people you're with, what you did just before, or some combination of those things. And then the cues prompt the behavior of the habit. We become motivated to continue the behavior repeatedly or make it a habit when it provides some sense of satisfaction. However, when the sense of satisfaction is followed by negative side effects, this is a signal that we need to improve or change the habit. So let's look at an example. Every night after cleaning up from dinner, Jasmine feels an urge to sit on the couch and watch a show because after a long day, she just wants to take it easy and relax. And though she doesn't plan for this, she ends up staying up way later than she wants to because it's really hard to stop watching after just one episode. And day after day, she wakes up tired in the morning because she stayed up too late, and she promises herself the next night she'll go to bed earlier. For Jasmine, the cue that starts her habit loop is completing her last responsibility of the day, which is cleaning up from dinner. This cue leads to the behavior of sitting on the couch and starting a show, which gives her the satisfaction of relaxation after a tiring day. But this behavior also results in a negative side effect of Jasmine often going to bed later than she wants to and waking up really tired. Understanding the habit loop is the first step in helping Jasmine cultivate a habit that better aligns with what she wants and what she needs. By interrupting this habit loop, she can work towards creating a new habit. Maybe Jasmine adds one more small task to her dinner cleanup routine. She sets the microwave timer for how long she'd like to sit on the couch, and she sets a mug with the tea bag on the counter by the microwave. After this, she gets her end of the day couch time, but when the timer in the kitchen goes off, this interrupts her usual habit. She has to get up and go to the kitchen to turn it off and gets to make herself a calming cup of tea to take up with her to bed, which provides a relaxing activity in a different way that doesn't have the same negative side effects of making her tired. So this was just one example of identifying a habit loop and looking for ways to interrupt it. In this next video you're about to see, you will see another example of how we can look out for our future selves by identifying and updating the habit loops that impact our day-to-day lives.
In this video, we'll get into the details of how to nurture habits that make our lives easier and happier, starting with habits that can help us manage stress. Stress can make us feel anxious, angry, and sad, and sometimes all of those emotions at the same time. We don't always realize it, but these emotional states make it difficult to focus on assignments at school or work, think clearly about decisions, or communicate in a kind, clear way. Stress also affects our physical health. In the short term, we may have problems like stomach aches, headaches, and trouble sleeping. In the future, we may have a lower resistance to illness, feel overwhelmed by life, or feel like we need alcohol or drugs to get by. The truth is that we can't avoid every stressful situation, but we can look out for our future selves if we learn how to crush habits that make stress worse. Let's look at one example of how it can be done. Sophia gets stressed about babysitting her little brother Diego every day after school. She feels like taking care of Diego doesn't leave enough time for her own life. She has to help him with his homework, keep him entertained so he doesn't get into mischief, and make him dinner. You can't blame Sophia for being unhappy about babysitting, but she has a habit that makes her more stressed out, complaining about it. Every day the habit starts when Sophia is leaving school in a rush and she sees her good friend, Nicole. She only has a couple of minutes to socialize before she has to get Diego at his school. Sophia blurts out a string of complaints, like how she has no time to hang out with friends, how she can't get started on her homework until late at night, and how unfair it is that she doesn't even get paid for babysitting. When Sophia complains, she feels better for a moment, just because she's able to connect with Nicole. But sharing every bad thing about the situation doesn't make it go away, and dwelling on it actually makes Sophia more stressed out in the long run. It's difficult for her to relax and focus even when she's not babysitting, but she can crush the complaining habit. We get better at crushing the habits we don't want to have and creating the ones we do when we understand how a process called the habit loop trains our brains to do the same thing over and over again. A habit loop starts with a cue, which can be anything that reminds us of doing the habit, like a certain feeling, which could be emotional or physical, a time of day, a place, people you're with, what you did just before, or some combination of those things. With Sophia's habit of complaining, there are three main cues: a feeling, which is stress, a certain time, 3 o'clock, when she's leaving school, and the person she's with, her friend Nicole. The cues prompt the behavior of the habit. Sophia's behavior is complaining to Nicole about babysitting. A behavior becomes a habit because it provides some sense of satisfaction. Complaining gives Sophia the satisfaction of connecting with a friend before she has to spend hours alone with her little brother. However, we can recognize that we need to improve the habit when the sense of satisfaction is followed by negative side effects. When Sophia complains about babysitting, she gets into a bad mood. She feels tense in her shoulders, and she realizes she annoys Nicole. Sophia doesn't like any of that, but when she's stressed out, it's as if she complains automatically. Simply being aware of the cues that prompt the behavior can help Sophia stop herself from complaining. But here's a strategy that will make it more likely she'll crush the habit for good. Sophia can let the same cues prompt a better behavior, taking a breath and asking Nicole what was good about her day. Sophia still gets the satisfaction of connecting with her friend Nicole, but talking about the good things that happened that day won't make Sophia stressed out or tense, or annoy Nicole. Sophia can also use the habit loop to nurture a habit that prevents her from getting stressed. She saw in the news that mindful breathing helps people reduce stress, so she wants to create the habit of doing mindful breathing exercises every weekday. She downloaded an app that has recorded exercises and tried to do them between dinner and homework. But she was dozing off because she was too full, so she hasn't kept up with it. But she can make sure it gets into her daily routine if she plans it out with the habit loop. Sophia can move her mindful breathing habit to the morning, when she's usually not as sleepy, and use the cue of what she did just before, which will be catching the city bus she takes to school every weekday. Catching the bus will prompt Sophia to do the behavior she chose, a mindful breathing exercise. And then doing mindful breathing exercises will have the satisfaction of preventing Sophia from feeling stressed. Oh, and let's keep this in mind. When it's tough to get a habit started, sometimes a small reward motivates us to stick to it. So whenever Sophia has a full week of breathing exercises, she can treat herself to a breakfast sandwich instead of having her usual granola bar. Okay, so it's a good time for another pet thought. Remember, stress can harm our emotional state and physical health over time. So look out for your future self. Use the habit loop to crush habits that make stress worse, and also nurture habits that prevent stress.
So you've now gotten to see a few examples of habit loops and ways that we can interrupt them. To support students in noticing and interrogating the habits in their lives, provide opportunities for students to engage in conversation about the habits that support or counteract the things that they care about. Help them brainstorm ways to interrupt negative habit loops or to support positive ones. Habits make up so much of our daily actions and automatic behaviors. Being thoughtful and intentional about habits makes it easier to achieve what matters to you and to behave in ways that align with your goals.